We are in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and our outline covers verses 8 through 10. And so today we will look at 9 and 10 primarily. So as you will see on your outline right in the middle of the page, letter C, it says, chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, modesty and decorum among God's women. So now we turn to focus on Paul's instructions for Christian women. And again, as far as the context is concerned, we're talking about in the church. That's chapter 3, verse 15, in the church of God. But many of these principles, of course, go back to the creation account, which Paul will allude to before the text is finished, before the chapter is finished. And so we're really talking about created order. We're talking about distinctions between men and women that were set in place by God himself, by the Creator, since the very beginning when he created Adam and Eve, when he created man and woman, and delineated their specific role distinctions. And so Paul is really capitalizing on that, alluding, I guess, to that truth when he gives his own instruction to the church. So last week we looked at verse 8 that focused on the men. I desire, therefore, that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and quarreling, probably. My translation says doubting. And then in verse 9, he turns to specifically address the women's instructions here. In like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but rather which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. So verse 9, as we said here, he says, in like manner, and I think he means just like I've addressed the males of the church, the adult males, which is the word for men here, I'm now going to, in like manner, address the adult females, which is the word gune in this passage, the women. And of course, it's not a... We might expect him to say something like, I desire that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands, and that the women, do this or that in the worship assembly. But he doesn't do that. He addresses their apparel. And I think I brought this point out last week when we made the point that the differences between men and women that Paul addressed speak to specific needs, especially in Ephesus, but in the first century, and things that are unique to the two genders that they're prone to fall into, right? So the men are addressed that they need to be the leaders in the congregation. They're going to be the ones that lead in the prayer. They're going to be the ones that are in a position of leadership. And then he says, when he addresses the women, it has to do with women have a propensity sometimes to focus too much on their outward appearance and their makeup or their dress or their wardrobe or things like that. So he addresses that. That's why I think he addresses that particular issue. I mean, you don't get any sense of that throughout the book yet, but here he just jumps right into the apparel. And so we'll talk about that as we go through our notes here. So this has to do with what he says with modesty, or my translation says propriety and moderation. So it's, as my text says, or as my notes say, modesty and decorum among Christian women. And as you can see under that, I have positive, negative, and positive. In other words, he gives a positive injunction, and then he gives a negative injunction, not like this. And then he gives another positive, with good works. So here's the first positive, that they adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation. Whenever we talk about the word modesty, especially in our own culture today in 21st century, we often think only of females who are dressing in clothing that is too little or too tight. In other words, something that is an attempt to display maybe their sexuality, right? And so we say that's not modest. And if that's true, that's a true statement. That's not modest. But modesty covers more than just that. though that is definitely covered in the idea of modesty. And that's often the very thing that we really need to focus on in our own culture today, because women do tend to want to show cleavage and show curves, show skin, and unfortunately, sometimes girls are raised in such a way that they get the idea that this is somehow showing their qualities, right? Showing their value or whatnot. That's certainly unbiblical. God wants women to dress modestly. In other words, not to focus on their sexuality. And in other words, what God's woman would want to focus on is showing modesty and preserving their bodies for their husbands, right? And that's, again, this is all part of the created order. This is part of the way God created not only the marriage relationship, but sexuality. And so we certainly want to emphasize this idea about modesty, including covering one's body sufficiently. And that is very, very important. And of course, it's easy here to apply this to Christian families, mothers and fathers raising daughters. To the way I sometimes word it is, it's good to teach your daughter to feel naked when she's naked. Does that make sense? Because what people have to do if a girl grows up and dresses immodestly, she has to suppress that feeling of nakedness. And then it becomes more natural for her, and she doesn't feel naked any longer, and it makes her feel, like she's doing the right thing. But no, I think Christian parents really need to say that feeling of nakedness is something that is part of the way God, wants your conscience to work. So if you feel naked, cover up, right? Because that's a good awareness to have. So don't suppress it. But unfortunately, we want to raise our daughters, dressing in certain ways for whatever activity they may be involved in that really is not something that you would want her to dress in as an 18-year-old. And then we're surprised when they get confused when they get older. You're like, no, you can't wear that anymore. Well, just don't do it to begin with and be consistent throughout. I'm sorry if this is offensive, but I'm not a preacher to make sure I don't offend everybody. I've got to strive to preach what I think the Bible is saying here. So, Carter?
So, in school, we had a really big issue with girls dressing immodestly in our, we had basically our Christian Student Center we had that, the Church of Christ supported and was like, hey, this is a good, evangelistic thing. And there's a lot of girls there that didn't dress appropriately. And so we came together and we used this passage as kind of a proof point for both men and women about how we present ourselves as Christians to people around us. And so when I look at this passage, I don't think that, the main thrust here that Paul's trying to get across is, oh, women just need to dress modestly, and men, you're good on modesty, you just need to pray all the time. Really, it's how do we present ourselves to people in general? So for men, are we calm? Are we collected? Are decisions not made by, wrath and anger? And do we pray about things? And are we always praying about things? And are we being leaders? Women, the way you dress, when people look at you, do they see a godly woman or do they see a woman for her body?
Right.
It's just questions like that. How do we present ourselves and people look at us and go, that's a good godly man or that's a good godly woman, instead of, oh, he has anger issues or she
Exactly.
dresses modestly or she has a nice body or she looks beautiful. If that's the first thing that comes to mind, then are we really professing ourselves as Christians first and foremost?
Yeah, I think those are great comments. And, it kind of just exposes why I think Paul focuses on these particular instructions to the different genders, is because, this kind of hits at the heart of what God expects from the two different genders. Men, you need to be strong. You need to be strong leaders for the Lord, right? Not for your own superiority, but you need to be strong for your wife. You need to be strong for your children. You need to be strong for your community, for the church, right? I mean, without strong men, God's design is foiled, right? That's not the way it's supposed to be. And it's going to suffer as a result of it. And so that's, what's saying. Now, what about women? Women, you need to deport, with, what's the word? Comport yourself. I'm probably blowing the English there, but I'm from Oklahoma. The point is that women, you need to present yourselves as women, as godly women. And that is to say, where you draw attention to a godly countenance, right? Not to sexuality, ostentatiousness. Surprised an Okie would know that word, aren't you? But anyway, that's kind of where Paul, I think, goes with this. As the rest of these notes in this paragraph says, he's not just talking about dressing to expose the body in a sexually provocative way. While this instruction, it certainly includes that, it also covers any attitude that seeks to illicitly draw attention to one's body or affluence.
So is that where it comes in with the braided hair and the
Yes.
jewelry?
Yes.
That's always been confusing.
Yes. This was a Roman custom, to go to the beauty parlors and see how many jewels you can get braided into your hair so that you can show your affluence. Yeah, so that has the cultural background to it, but that's why Paul focuses on it. But you can see the application is pretty easy, which is what I tried to state right here. Illicitly drawing attention to your body or to your affluence. Yes.
Playing the devil's advocate.
Okay.
Being around teenagers a lot and bringing up a daughter in this generation. I dealt with this a lot.
Mhm.
And she says, well, it's their problem if they look at me in a different light. How do you deal with that?
It's their problem. Who's they, and what do you mean?
The men.
It's the men's problem?
It's the
Well, you
men's
just have to go
problem
back and
if
say,
they
is,
don't see me, if they look at me as a sexual being instead of look at me for my godliness.
right, and you're saying, so if they dress in a kind of a provocative way, then they can make that point, then how do we respond to that? I would say, what does the Bible say about it?
And
The Bible says, well, if they don't believe the Bible, there's not a whole lot you can do as
Well,
far as from the authority of the Lord.
It goes back to the point of, well, what's modesty?
Yeah,
I would also add because I've heard that argument 100 times, not that they brought up in the discussion that we had.
yeah,
And, I'm sure there's 100 different answers people have given about what we could do. But for me, the thing that I've studied is that we need to teach boys and men especially what to look for in a woman.
yeah,
She may have a beautiful body and that's how they dress,
Mhm.
but that's not what we should be pining after and what we should want and what we should
well, sure,
look for first and foremost. And if anything, we should shun that behavior. Not shun
Yeah.
in the sense like, you.
Well, I mean,
It's like, that's not what I'm looking for, that's not what I need.
but you also look at her and say, do I want this to be the mother of my children?
That too.
Because you want somebody who is godly, yeah. Back to what is modest, I mean, something that's going to take wisdom, it's going to take awareness. But the bottom line is, there's not always, so we had this problem whenever I was directing a camp up in, where I used to work. And we'd be like, hey, now how long do the shorts have to be? Okay, well, you can get a mannequin out there and you can draw a line on the leg and say, here's the line. Now, as a camp director, I can do that because I'm the one who is responsible for the camp itself. As far as God is concerned, I can't draw a line, but I can go, okay, this is obviously cross the line. To anybody who has any kind of biblical wisdom, you can know, listen, that's pretty ridiculous, right? And and so it's like, the way I put it is, I may not always be able to draw the specific line on what is modest, but it's something that you can tell. If you have biblical wisdom, you can tell when it's been crossed. Now, with teenagers that you're talking about, if they don't have biblical wisdom, if they haven't been taught any of these things, you just have to do what you can to explain those things. That, listen, whenever you become influenced by the scriptures, they will inform your convictions and they will inform your conscience, if you let them. So that's the best that I would know to say on that regard. But when you're dealing with people who don't have biblical influence in their lives, then, well, you get a culture like what we have today, but you also run into the difficulties with raising children in the midst of that. But you got to teach your daughters, we're not the world. We're not of the world. We're to be of Christ. And we look forward to fellowship with him, and this is just the way it is to be a Christian. God never said, hey, it's going to be a piece of cake. No, in fact, he said the opposite. You have to stand contrary to the world many times. Yes.
I think that's why it's really important for Christian parents to start with children who are young.
Yeah.
And then it's also just as important, I think, because your children live under your roof and are your responsibility. And you have all the power, really, basically.
Yeah, it's your home.
Right, and
Mhm.
if their fathers are allowing their daughters to walk out the door, I mean, the daughters don't have any money. You know, somebody's buying those things.
Sure.
And it goes with the boys too, it's, they have responsibility with their
Right.
young men as far as, teaching them.
You know, this is a teaching that is more and more controversial even among members of the church. I have several friends who preach in very large congregations. And it's amazing if you go to the Facebook pages of many of these families that are good families. I mean, strong in the church as far as their work in the church, the things that they do, their generosity, their kindness and all that. And yet they seem to have a blind spot. And again, I'm sorry, that's just the facts. And, but I have confidence in the hearts in this room that you all are honest enough to consider whether or not these things are true. But it's not going to stop me, it's not going to stop Steve from upholding these truths. I mean, even if it's not popular or comfortable.
But different people have different blind spots and different.
Absolutely.
Everything that's said.
Absolutely.
And that's.
I want my blind spots uncovered as well.
And I do too.
I mean, I say that. When it's uncovered, I want to go, oh, I don't want to hear that. But do I want to, that's the whole issue. But I appreciate that. That's exactly right. We all have those blind spots. Yes.
And this is not a new problem. Okay, go back all the way in Proverbs, where Solomon is talking about the fool and a wise man, and he uses many examples of what the fool follows of a woman that is seductive or out on the streets or whatever it may be, and draws attention to that. And Solomon says that, hey, the fool is somebody that goes
After that.
So again, this is a age-old problem, not minimizing that we need to address it in our generation. I can't go back and fix a couple of thousand years ago.
Sure.
I'm not that old.
Yeah.
But so we need to understand that the Bible speaks to this
Yeah.
from way back.
Absolutely.
We need to make sure that we understand, as you've exactly pointed out, that this is our relationship with God, and how we dress, and how we act in services, or men as specifically our
Absolutely.
genders, reflects our relationship with God. And back to your question, Lane, that's where we gotta work, is build that relationship, and then the clothes
Yep.
don't matter, because they'll be fixed.
Yeah. Yeah. What's modest? It's the way a godly-minded woman will dress. That's modest. Does that make sense? But it's like Carter was pointing out, God, and I think Eileen was asking about, God puts responsibility on both sides of this thing. Men have a responsibility to keep their minds pure, and women have a responsibility to dress modestly or to dress appropriately as a Christian woman. So it's not first thing you often think of, or at least that strikes me when a woman starts bringing up, well, men, they shouldn't, it's their problem. They're wanting to justify the way that they present themselves. And it's just a, cop-out, so to speak. Wow. I better call on Steve because, yes, Steve.
I would just say for God's people to stop with the yoga pants.
With the what?
With the yoga pants.
Okay.
Number one. Because, I'm not interested in seeing every nook and cranny of a woman's body.
Yeah,
Particularly in the church.
right.
Okay? That's why we have mirrors. I would hope that our beloved sisters would look in the mirror before they step out the door, to examine themselves, to see if how they're dressed is appropriate. So
Could-
back to Eileen's point about, you know, what the man should look. I think that there's a big disconnect between the way women are made and the way men are made. We are very different. We see things very, very differently. A man sees things sexually a lot of the time. Men in the church and our sisters need to understand that.
Absolutely.
So stop with the yoga bridges.
I don't need to add anything to it. Steve, being a fellow elder, he can teach this class on his own. But that's right.
Well, sure, it covers all that.
Stop with the yoga bridges.
Well, as long as the shirt goes down,
That's the-
yeah, let me draw a line for you, as long as it goes right here. Yes, Mary.
I just want to mention here that it's not only women dress that way nowadays, the men also dress provocatively. And, you know, we're human
Right.
too, women are human too. So I think both of these passages, the beginning and how to pray, and
Now-
the second part, could be addressed to men.
Well, that would be my question here. And again, I'm not denying what you're saying. I'm just saying now, where can we go in the Bible to get that point? See my point? Paul doesn't talk about that here. And I'm trying to think where else in the Bible would say, okay, man, you need to dress modestly.
Because women don't look the same way as men do, and women don't look at men like men look at
Right,
women.
that's my point.
And I-
And that's why Jesus says to the men, right, whoever looks upon a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. Men have that, their natural way they're created is that they are visual, right? They see things, and that's something that can spark their, you know, and I know it can happen with women, but primarily the woman is more into words and actions, and you know what I'm saying? There's just differences between the genders, and I'm not denying what you're saying, Mary. I'm just saying, you know, would we be distracting ourselves from the real point that God is trying to make by bringing up all these other little nuances that, well, you know, there's nothing necessarily wrong with making those kinds of statements, but if we're going to teach the Bible, where would we go to a passage that actually talks about women that men should not dress in a sexually provocative way? And I'm not saying it's not a healthy idea, but I'm just saying, let's think through it biblically, and where would we go? Jeffrey said he has a passage.
Romans 14, right? We're responsible.
I don't know. Read the verse so that I'll know what you're talking about.
Well, it's the whole pack. It's not specifically, explicitly stating that about our appearance, but it's talking about us being responsible for each other, right?
Right.
As Christians, and so if we're provoking someone to sexual thoughts, then we're guilty
Yes.
of causing our
I agree.
brothers to stumble.
I agree.
And so realistically, if you're wearing yoga pants and thinking that it's the man's responsibility
Yes.
to not lust upon a woman.
I see what you're saying, yes. No man lives unto himself, no man dies unto himself. The idea is that we do have a responsibility toward our brother. Am I my brother's keeper? Yes, you are. You know, you need to be careful to not tempt and so forth. I guess the question I was asking had to do with men's dress, the way that they dressed. Now, that would apply Romans 14. It might be, man, you shouldn't try to seduce somebody who is not your wife, right? That would be unloving and ungodly and sinful. Women, you shouldn't try to seduce by your dress. Men, you shouldn't try to seduce by your words or by your attention and so forth. Does that make sense?
Women's train themselves to start looking at men. I mean, I don't think that.
Well, yeah, a culture might train you in that direction, and that so a Christian man needs that might be a good way to apply this. That our culture is increasingly visual, where women now are trained, even contrary to nature, which happens a lot, to become more visual than naturally would occur with them. And I think that's a good point to make, absolutely. And I know I'm having to pass over a lot of people, but guess we're going to have this class again or something. Yes.
Back in the 70s, when I was attending a interior design, fashion merchandising, and sex
What?
sex.
Oh, that's a statement. I thought you said I was attending a thing and sex sells. Sorry. I got choked up on that one. Yes, you're right, Terry. Sex sells, yes. Well, yeah, that's right. And so whenever you have a billboard, or whatever that has sexually provocative things, it's going to attract a man. Primarily, it's going to attract a man. Jesus teaches us, the scriptures teach us, Christian men, you don't have control over what's on the billboard. That's not necessarily under your control. You do have control on what you allow your eyes to fix on. So don't look at it, or keep your mind pure, and so forth. So these are the kinds of things that are unique to these genders that we've been talking about. I do appreciate it, Steve.
One last comment.
Do you want to come up here behind the microphone? It'd probably be best.
Romans 12:1, right?
Okay.
Present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy.
And acceptable to God.
That's being human.
Yeah, absolutely.
That sums it up.
Excellent stuff. Steve referred to Romans 12:1. I beseech you, therefore, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And that applies to men and women alike. So that's exactly right. Excellent. Jen?
I don't disagree at all with your original statement that, the point of this is, not revealing yourself and the affluence part of it.
Yes.
But I have to wonder if, I haven't looked at, I have to wonder if part of the confusion about modesty, and I don't know the actual Greek literal translation for that, but it seems like, from an English standpoint, it goes modesty, 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 if you read it wrong. If you look at modest, I feel like this is more talking about financial, immodesty. Like it says, the naming portion about, pearls and jewelry. I don't think that that's a Roman problem. I think that's an everyday problem.
Yeah.
Throughout centuries. But and then it goes on to say propriety and moderation, or mine says decency. You think decency and propriety, that means obviously cover yourself up. So,
Yeah.
I guess my point is that, it almost focuses, we can almost read it and focus too much on just the revealing nature.
Yes.
And, you can reveal just as much in a pair of blue jeans as a pair of yoga pants.
Right.
Right?
Too tight,
So when you hear stuff like that, it makes it, intense.
when you hear stuff
The
like
rest
what?
of the pair, you almost ignore the rest of it.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring that point up, and it's well taken, because if you notice in my notes, if you were just to step back and look at all of my notes, that's really the point I was trying to make, because I only had one or two sentences. I said, we almost always just immediately go to modesty as far as sexual provocative dress, but really Paul is saying this, right? And then I even deal with it for another 2 paragraphs, more what Jana was saying. So well taken and true as can be. But the point I would make, from at least to explain why we spent so much time in this class on it, is because the idea of modesty does include the sexually provocative dress as well. And even Jeff brought up Old Testament passages that give examples of women dressing in such a way that the man follows. And also the fact that our society that we live in has a special need to understand that. Does that make sense? It's not so much that we have a need to say, women, you need to stop dressing so ostentatiously in church. Nobody does that, but I shouldn't say nobody, but that's not nearly the problem of women coming to services dressed with their cleavage showing or in tight pants or whatever, right? So I think that's probably why why we had so many comments about it and so many good thoughts about it. So what I'm saying, Jana, is that's an excellent point and you're right on the money. But I think that it's still appropriate to talk about the modesty in the sense of sexually provocative clothing, just because we know that is a biblical truth. And our culture is especially ripe for such attention, right? Such instruction. So I appreciate that a lot. Very good stuff. We have 3 minutes left. Let me just, and here's a good way to stop. See number 2 there under C? I'm just going to read this because it's something that we've talked about a little bit. And then we can pick up next week with the rest of the outline. But it says number 2, the negative. Here's where Paul says, not with. So I want you to dress modestly and so forth, but not, that means not with, and then he says braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing. Now, like what Jana said, I mean, every culture has its example of ostentatious and expensive, affluent dress, right? But I'm saying this is a specific thing. You can just look at Roman historians to say this idea of braiding the pearls and braiding the diamonds and whatnot into the hair was a specifically Roman thing. I mean, you can even see some Roman busts that were made with certain women on there, and they have that, their hair is like a wreath, and it's woven with all kinds of jewels in it. And so Paul, I think, is alluding to that idea that would have been popular in Ephesus and in the Roman world at the time, where that's an example of a person trying to draw attention to their affluence. So there were Christians in the church who were affluent, and that's wonderful, and so forth. But Paul here is just simply giving this instruction, it's right there in your scriptures, about that specific issue. And so I think that that's what we have here. There were popular hair and jewelry styles that defined cultural cliques in the Roman world, and Paul warns the Christian women to avoid them. Christian women should avoid such focus on outward appearance. And there's another passage that we could look at later. 2 Peter 3:3 is the same thing, the outward adornment. Modesty in dress would exclude both, on the one hand, flippant, lost my place. A flippant, disrespectful attire, as well as gaudy, ostentatious attire. And I have an example there from James chapter 2, where it talks about if a man should come in and wearing a nice expensive suit and rings and gold and all that, and you say, hey, I want to give you a good spot up here, we really like you. And then somebody comes in with tatters and you say, sit in the back. So there's kind of the both ends of the spectrum, right? The point is like I say here, either extreme should be avoided. You don't want to be disrespectful in your attire. Now, the poor man in James 2, by the way, is not trying to show disrespect. He's just poor. And so we understand that. But I'm saying wearing, Harley Davidson shirt or something, I'm just coming up with something off the top of my head. I'm sure there could be further discussion on it. But I think you would know, if you're just slothful, that's not acceptable. But neither is the other end of the where you're trying to show and display to everybody how wealthy and ostentatious you are. These instructions castigate both materialism and vanity. And there's a passage in Isaiah 3 for you to read if you would like to. I really appreciate the attention and all the comments. And again, I'm thankful for the power of the Word of God. And may He receive all the glory. We'll be dismissed from our class now.